western Minnesota, October 1887. While neighbors rushed to bank their cabins with the usual foot of straw and manure before winter, Norwegian homesteader Lars Nilsson was still digging. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He was cutting a trench 3 feet deep around his 16 by 24-foot log cabin, moving 30 cubic yards of soil by hand to build a massive dirt ramp that rose 4 feet thick at a 45-degree angle, all the way up to his windowsills. They laughed as he literally buried the bottom half of his own house. Standard frontier wisdom said a foot of loose banking and a hot stove would get any family through winter. Then January 12th, 1888 arrived. The school children's blizzard slammed through with 50-mile-per-hour winds and temperatures plunging from 30 degrees to 20 below zero in hours. Standard cabins failed catastrophically. Floors dropped to 25 degrees while families burned through cords of wood in days. But that buried cabin? The floor held steady at 55 degrees. Children played on bare planks in shirt sleeves, while their parents used half the firewood of their neighbors. What did this immigrant understand about frost lines, thermal mass, and ground temperature that everyone else missed? And how did his dirt ramp prove that the earth beneath their feet held the key to surviving the deadliest winter on the northern plains? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Early October 1887 brought the first hard frost to western Minnesota, turning prairie grass silver and sending steam from horse nostrils in the morning air. On a gentle rise 3 miles south of the settlement, Lars Nilsson's 16 by 24-foot hewn log cabin stood alone against the horizon. 8-inch pine logs, 7 feet to the plate, with windowsills positioned 3 feet above the plank floor, it looked like every other homestead cabin dotting the territory, except for what Lars was doing to it. He stood in a trench that ran completely around his house, 2.5 feet deep and wide enough for a man to work comfortably with a spade. Methodically, he shoveled rich black soil from the excavation and built it into a sloping ramp against his cabin walls. The earth pile rose at a 45-degree angle, reaching outward 5 feet from the foundation before it touched the original ground level. By mid-morning, the ramp was already 2 feet high and climbing toward the bottom edge of his window frames. A neighbor's wagon slowed on the nearby trail. Henry Dobson pulled his team to a halt and called across the distance with the kind of laugh that carries mockery. "Bury it deep enough, Lars. You won't have to shovel the roof come spring." His wife Anna covered her mouth, but her shoulders shook with barely suppressed amusement. They drove on, leaving Lars to his incomprehensible project. The image struck every passerby the same way. It looked exactly like a man burying his own house. The dirt ramp would eventually reach within 6 inches of his windowsills, wrapping the entire cabin in what appeared to be a small earthen hill. To frontier eyes accustomed to cabins standing proud and exposed above the prairie, it seemed like madness. Lars had been calculating this project since the previous winter. His youngest daughter had spent February nights coughing on floorboards that measured barely 30 degrees even when the cast iron stove glowed cherry red. He remembered dipping a tin cup in the water bucket each morning and finding it skinned with ice, despite keeping the fire banked through the night. The problem wasn't the stove, it was the ground beneath his feet and the wind that scoured the lower logs. The solution came from memories that stretched back to coastal Norway, where his father had shown him barns built halfway into hillsides with sod-covered roofs. Those structures stayed bearably warm even when North Sea gales howled for weeks. The earth didn't fight the cold, it held a steady temperature that had nothing to do with the weather above. A Dakota man he'd met at the grain elevator had mentioned something similar about traditional earth lodges, how several feet of packed soil around the walls kept the interior livable when prairie winters turned deadly. Minnesota's frost line routinely reached 4 to 5 feet down, sometimes deeper in the hardest years. But below that frozen zone, the soil held closer to the average annual temperature, somewhere in the mid-40s, with deeper earth often near 50 degrees. Lars reasoned that if he could wrap his cabin's foundation in a thick blanket of that stable temperature earth, he might push the frost line away from his walls entirely. Instead of his floor fighting 80-degree temperature differences between a warm room and sub-zero air, it would only have to bridge 15 or 20 degrees between room temperature and earth in the 40s. The mathematics seemed obvious once he thought it through. 4 feet of packed soil at a 45-degree slope would create a massive, wind-tight barrier between his lower walls and the outside air. Prairie winds that normally hit his foundation logs directly would instead flow over a smooth ramp of earth and snow. Any gaps in his chinking would leak into soil at 45 degrees instead of open air at 20 below zero. By late October, neighbors began stopping their wagons just to stare. The earthen ramp now reached to within inches of Lars's window frames, completely encasing the bottom half of his cabin. He had moved an estimated 28 cubic yards of soil entirely by hand, working methodically through the shortening autumn days. Between the soil and his log walls, he had installed simple wood planks sealed with birch bark and coated with pine tar, an old-world technique his father had used to shed water away from timbers. The skepticism wasn't quiet. Henry Dobson made sure everyone at the settlement heard his opinion. "That dirt's going to rot his logs from the bottom up. Mark my words, he'll be rebuilding the whole foundation in 5 years if dampness doesn't freeze him out first winter." Others nodded agreement. Standard frontier practice called for banking cabins with a foot of loose straw or manure around the foundation, maybe some corn stalks if a man was being thorough. Snow would drift up later and add to the insulation. What Lars had built looked like a burial mound. Pastor Anders Johansson rode by on his weekly circuit and reined in his horse to study the unusual sight. The cabin appeared to be growing from the earth itself, as if it had been there for decades rather than months. He dismounted and walked the perimeter, noting how the ramp shed water away from the building and how carefully Lars had graded the slope. "Interesting approach," he said finally. "Your father built this way in the old country?" Lars nodded. "Earth doesn't change temperature like air does. Stays steady all winter long." He gestured toward the ramp. "Wind can't get to the bottom logs now. Floor should hold warmer." The pastor made a note in the small journal he carried for his circuit reports. Norwegian methods were often sound, even when they looked strange to American eyes. Still, he wondered privately whether Lars hadn't taken a reasonable principle too far. The amount of earth involved seemed excessive for what amounted to glorified banking. By the first week of November, the settlement had reached a quiet consensus. Lars Nilsson had built himself a peculiar earthwork that might or might not keep his family warm, but would certainly provide entertainment when it either succeeded spectacularly or failed in some memorable fashion. The real test would come when deep cold arrived and they could measure what that buried cabin actually accomplished compared to conventional frontier building methods. The first snow was already falling, and everyone would have their answer soon enough. The first hard freeze arrived November 15th, 1887, turning water buckets to solid ice and barn doors too stiff to swing without kicking. Across the settlement, families woke to the familiar frontier ritual of coaxing reluctant fires back to life, while their breath formed clouds inside their own cabins. By full daylight, the temperature difference between various homesteads began telling a story that would reshape how these Norwegian and German immigrants thought about building in Minnesota. Henry Dobson stepped barefoot from his bed onto floorboards that might as well have been sheets of ice. Near his cast-iron stove, where the air held a tolerable 60 degrees, his wife Anna was already feeding split oak to the firebox. But 20 feet away, along the exterior walls, rime frost bloomed between the floorboards, like winter flowers. The children had learned to sleep in wool stockings and keep their heaviest clothes within arm's reach of their beds. 3 miles south, Lars Nilsson was conducting an experiment that would have seemed obsessive to his neighbors if they had witnessed it. Each morning before dawn, he checked 3 simple alcohol thermometers positioned at different points in his cabin. One hung at head height near his stove, measuring the air temperature where adults worked and moved. Another lay flat on the floor at the center of the room, recording the temperature where children played and families spent their evening hours. The third stayed outside, sheltered under his eaves, tracking the ambient air temperature that every other cabin fought against. The numbers told a story that contradicted everything frontier wisdom taught about heating a log house. Outside temperature at dawn, 12 degrees. Air near Lars's stove, 62 degrees. Floor temperature at the center of his cabin, 54 degrees. The floorboards felt pleasantly warm to bare feet, warm enough that his youngest daughter had taken to spreading her quilts directly on the planks for afternoon naps. The physics were straightforward once a man understood what was happening beneath the floor. In conventional cabins, heat moved through three basic mechanisms that frontier builders rarely considered systematically. Conduction pulled warmth directly from room air down through floorboards and into the cold earth below. Convection created drafts as warm air near the ceiling cooled and sank toward the floor, where gaps between logs and chinking allowed it to escape into sub-zero outside air. Radiation meant that every surface in contact with exterior walls lost heat to the surrounding cold. Lars's earth berm had fundamentally altered all three processes. The lowest three courses of his log walls, roughly 2.5 feet of what had been exterior surface, now sat surrounded by soil that held steady near 45 degrees instead of air at 12 below. Conduction still occurred, but instead of fighting an 80-degree temperature difference, his floor only had to bridge 20 degrees between room air and the stable earth temperature his ramp had created. More importantly, wind could no longer scour heat from his foundation. Prairie winds that had once hit his lower logs directly now flowed over the smooth surface of frozen earth and packed snow. Any air that leaked through gaps in his chinking now entered soil at 45 degrees rather than open air at 20 below zero. The convection currents that normally pulled warm air from ceiling to floor and out through foundation gaps now circulated within a thermal envelope that never dropped below the mid-40s. Henry Dobson borrowed Lars's floor thermometer one particularly cold morning when outside temperatures had dropped to 8 degrees. He placed it on his own floorboards near the exterior wall and left it overnight. The reading at dawn, 28 degrees. Water spilled on his floor would freeze into a thin sheet within minutes. His children had developed the frontier habit of keeping their feet tucked under them when sitting on the floor, even close to the stove. The same night, Lars recorded 55 degrees on his floor, warm enough that his dog preferred sleeping on the planks to joining the family near the fire. The contrast wasn't subtle. It was the difference between a floor that felt like an extension of winter and one that felt like a continuation of the warm room above it. Word of these measurements spread through the settlement with the peculiar speed of frontier gossip. Pastor Johansson made careful notes during his visits, recording not just temperatures but fuel consumption. Lars was burning through his woodpile at roughly 2/3 the rate of comparable cabins. With similar-sized stoves heating similar-sized spaces, he was stretching each cord of split oak and pine nearly 50% further than his neighbors. The skeptics had reasonable explanations. Henry insisted it was simply a mild start to winter, that the real test would come when January brought the killing cold that separated successful homesteads from abandoned claims. Others suggested that Lars's unusually thick log walls, he had selected 8-inch pine rather than the more common 6-inch, explained the difference more than his peculiar earthwork. But families throughout the settlement were beginning their own informal experiments. Anna Dobson started stacking extra quilts and 2 inches of loose straw on her floor near the children's sleeping area. Another neighbor hammered additional boards over the gaps between his floorboards, trying to slow the drafts that made sitting on the floor impossible during cold snaps. A German family began piling extra manure and corn stalks against their foundation, extending their banking higher than the traditional foot or so of loose material. None of these modifications approached the systematic thoroughness of Lars's approach, but they acknowledged the same fundamental problem. Heat was escaping through the floor faster than most frontier stoves could replace it. The standard solution: burn more wood, pile on more blankets, except that winters meant cold floors, was expensive in labor, dangerous in terms of fire risk, and exhausting for families trying to maintain normal life through months of sub-zero weather. By early December, the settlement's woodpiles told their own story. Lars had 4 cords stacked under his extended eaves and was burning through them so slowly that neighbors began estimating he might finish the winter with wood to spare. Henry Dobson had cut 8 cords the previous summer and was already calculating whether it would last until March. The mathematics were becoming unavoidably clear, even to the skeptics who still insisted that burying a good cabin in dirt would ultimately cause more problems than it solved. The real test was still coming. But the early evidence suggested that conventional frontier wisdom about heating log houses might be incomplete in ways that could prove costly when Minnesota winter arrived in earnest. The morning of January 12th, 1888, dawned deceptively mild across western Minnesota. At 28 degrees, the air felt almost balmy after weeks of bitter cold, and the crusted snow began softening under pale winter sunlight. Children walked to the one-room schoolhouse 3 miles east without their heaviest buffalo coats. Men rode to the settlement store wearing only wool jackets, discussing whether this might signal an early break in the winter's grip. The wind was nothing more than a gentle breeze from the southwest, barely strong enough to stir the bare branches of oak trees along the creek bottoms. By 11 o'clock that morning, the breeze had stiffened into something more insistent, but still nothing that concerned men who had weathered plains winters before. Henry Dobson was splitting oak behind his cabin when he noticed the wind had shifted direction, now coming hard from the northwest, and carrying a different quality of cold. The softened snow crust was beginning to harden again, and the pale sun had disappeared behind a wall of gray-white cloud that stretched from horizon to horizon. At noon, the front hit with the suddenness that would make this storm legendary across the Great Plains. The gentle northwest breeze became a howling gale of 40 to 50 miles per hour in the span of minutes. The temperature plunged from near freezing toward 20 below zero so quickly that men working outdoors could feel their exposed skin numbing as they struggled toward shelter. Most alarming of all, fine powdery snow began driving horizontally across the prairie, reducing visibility to mere yards and turning the familiar landscape into a white void where landmarks disappeared and directions became meaningless. This was the storm that would be remembered as the schoolchildren's blizzard, a weather event that would kill 235 people across the Great Plains when children and adults alike became lost between buildings that stood only yards apart. In Minnesota, the storm struck with particular viciousness, catching families who had been lulled by the mild morning into complacency about winter's remaining power. Inside Henry Dobson's cabin, the storm's assault began immediately. Fine snow found every gap in the chinking between logs, sifting into the room like flour through a sieve. Within an hour, powder had accumulated on the beds, the kitchen table, and the floor near the exterior walls. Worse than the snow was the wind itself, which seemed to reach inside the cabin through gaps Henry hadn't known existed. The draft across the floor became strong enough to make his wife's skirts flutter and his children's trouser legs snap like flags in a gale. Henry fed his stove, harder than he ever had, pushing the fire until the cast iron glowed dull red and the stovepipe radiated heat like a forge. The air near the ceiling reached 55 degrees, but the floor along the exterior walls dropped to 20 degrees, cold enough that spilled water froze solid within minutes. His children huddled together on mattresses pulled from their beds and placed as close to the stove as safely possible. But even there, the drafts at ankle level made keeping their feet warm nearly impossible. The family burned through a quarter cord of split oak in 6 hours, a consumption rate that would exhaust their entire winter supply within weeks if the cold persisted. Henry's wife wrapped heated stones from around the firebox in wool blankets and placed them at the children's feet, but the stones lost their warmth within an hour and had to be constantly reheated. By evening, ice was forming on the interior walls wherever they touched the outer logs, and frost flowers bloomed across the inside surface of the single window. 3 miles south, the storm was revealing the true purpose of what neighbors had mocked as Lars Nilsson's buried cabin. Outside, the earth berm had become a smooth shell of wind-packed snow and ice, deflecting the 40-mile-per-hour gusts up and over the structure like water flowing over a stone. The wind that was stripping heat from every conventional cabin in the settlement couldn't reach Lars's foundation logs at all. Inside the bermed cabin, Lars maintained his methodical temperature recordings even as the storm raged. He banked his fire conservatively, burning perhaps 1/8 the wood Henry was consuming per hour. Yet his floor thermometer read 53 degrees at midnight, warmer than the air temperature Henry was achieving near his red-hot stove. The children played on quilts spread directly on the bare floorboards, comfortable enough to remove their heaviest sweaters despite the fact that the worst blizzard in memory was howling just beyond their walls. The physics of what was occurring became starkly clear during the storm's peak intensity. Conventional cabins were fighting the full force of sub-zero air and wind against every square foot of their exterior surface. Heat pumped into the room near the ceiling was immediately drawn toward the floor by convection, where it leaked through chinking gaps into air that measured 25 degrees below zero. The temperature differential between indoor air and outdoor conditions created a massive heat drain that no reasonable amount of wood could overcome for long. Lars's berm had created an entirely different thermal environment. The wind couldn't strip heat from his lower walls because they were surrounded by earth that held steady near 45 degrees, even as its outer surface froze solid. His floor saw only a 15-degree temperature difference instead of the 80-degree challenge facing conventional construction. More importantly, any air that leaked through gaps in his chinking entered soil at 45 degrees rather than howling wind at 25 below. The Earth's thermal mass was working exactly as Lars had calculated. 4 feet of packed soil at the base of his walls, rising in a 45-degree slope to windowsill height, had created what amounted to a massive radiator that stayed connected to the stable temperature zone below the frost line. Even as the surface of his berm froze solid, the bulk of the earthwork remained tied to ground temperature that varied only a few degrees throughout the winter. By dawn on January 13th, the storm had buried most of western Minnesota under 3 feet of new snow, but its most devastating effect had been the wind-driven cold that found every weakness in frontier construction. Across the settlement, families had burned through their carefully rationed firewood at unsustainable rates while still enduring floors cold enough to freeze water solid. Several children showed early signs of frostbite despite never leaving their cabins. As the wind finally began to subside, a faint light appeared through the whiteout, a lantern bobbing uncertainly across the drifted landscape. Henry Dobson was leading his family through the aftermath of the blizzard, following the creek bed toward the one cabin that had weathered the storm without burning through a month's supply of wood in a single night. Behind him, 3 more families emerged from cabins where the floors had become uninhabitable, seeking shelter in the structure their community had once mocked as a man's folly for burying a perfectly good house in dirt. The lantern light grew steadier as Henry Dobson approached Lars Nilsson's cabin, through drifts that reached his waist in places. Behind him, his wife Anna carried their youngest, while their 2 older children struggled to keep up, their breath forming ice crystals on the wool scarves wrapped around their faces. The temperature had dropped to 30 below zero, and even the short walk from their own cabin had left them shaking with cold that seemed to penetrate straight through their heaviest clothes. When Lars opened his door, steam billowed from the warm interior into the frigid night air. The contrast was so dramatic that Henry's spectacles fogged instantly, leaving him momentarily blind as his family stumbled into the blessed warmth. As his vision cleared, he realized that what he was feeling wasn't just warm air, it was warmth rising from the floor itself, something he hadn't experienced in his own cabin since October. Within an hour, 2 more families had arrived at Lars's door. Pastor Johansson came leading the German family from the valley, their youngest boy showing white patches on his cheeks that spoke of dangerous exposure. The Olsen family followed shortly after, carrying their infant wrapped in every blanket they owned. By midnight, 14 people were crowded into the 16 by 24-foot space that had been built for 5. The remarkable thing wasn't the crowding frontier families were accustomed to sharing close quarters during emergencies. What stunned every adult in that cabin was the floor temperature. Anna Dobson knelt and pressed her palm to the bare planks near the far wall, expecting the familiar bite of cold wood. Instead, she found boards that felt genuinely warm to the touch. She called her husband over to confirm what seemed impossible. The floor was warmer than the air in their own cabin had been, with the stove burning full blast. Lars quietly demonstrated what the numbers meant by filling 2 shallow tin pans with water from his bucket. He placed one pan on his floor near the center of the room and set the other aside as a control. "Check it in the morning," he said simply. Henry nodded, though he was already calculating what the temperature difference implied about heat loss and fuel consumption. With so many bodies generating warmth, Lars actually had to dampen his fire to prevent the cabin from becoming uncomfortably hot. He burned less than 2 armloads of split oak over the entire night, roughly the same amount Henry had been feeding his stove every hour during the height of the storm. The children spread quilts directly on the floor and slept soundly, something that would have been impossible on the ice-cold planks they were accustomed to at home. Pastor Johansen found himself studying the construction with the methodical attention he usually reserved for Scripture. The earth berm outside had become a smooth dome of wind-packed snow, deflecting the storm's fury with an elegance that spoke to principles he was only beginning to understand. Inside, the mathematical precision of Lars's solution was becoming undeniable. The floor thermometer read 54 degrees at 2 in the morning, while outside temperatures had fallen to 32 below zero, an 86-degree differential that conventional cabin construction couldn't begin to bridge efficiently. The German father, whose own cabin had reached the point where ice formed on the interior walls 3 feet from his stove, walked the perimeter of Lars's room and found no frost anywhere. The single window showed condensation rather than ice crystals, and even the corners where 2 exterior walls met remained free of the rime that typically accumulated in such spots. He spoke limited English, but his incredulous shaking of the head needed no translation. Anna Dobson spent much of the night observing how the thermal environment affected the children's behavior. At home, her youngest had developed the habit of sitting with his feet tucked under him even near the stove, instinctively avoiding contact with the cold floor. Here, children played directly on the bare boards, sprawling comfortably on quilts without the layers of straw and extra blankets that had become necessary for floor sitting in conventional cabins. The difference wasn't subtle. It was the contrast between a floor that felt hostile to human comfort and one that actively supported it. The crowding that might have made other cabins unbearable worked in Lars's favor. 14 people in less than 400 square feet generated substantial body heat, but instead of creating stifling conditions near the ceiling while leaving the floor frigid, the stable floor temperature created an even thermal gradient throughout the room. People could sleep comfortably at floor level without feeling like they were fighting the cold seeping up through the boards. By dawn, the control experiment had delivered its verdict. The pan of water Lars had set on his floor remained liquid and measured 52 degrees when Pastor Johansen checked it with the thermometer. Henry recalled that similar pans in his own cabin during previous cold snaps had frozen solid enough to lift out as discs of ice. The 20-degree difference represented more than comfort. It was the margin between a habitable interior and one that became genuinely dangerous to children and elderly residents. The fuel efficiency implications were staggering when calculated across an entire winter. Henry estimated that Lars had burned 1/8 of a cord during the night while sheltering 14 people. At home, heating his smaller family through the same storm had consumed nearly a quarter cord. If the ratios held through the remainder of winter, Lars would finish the season having used roughly 3 cords total, while Henry burned through 7 or 8 cords for inferior heating performance. More telling than the mathematics were the small details that revealed how thoroughly Lars's approach solved the fundamental problem of frontier cabin heating. Coffee set on the floor near the wall stayed warm instead of cooling rapidly from contact with cold boards. Children's stockings dried when placed on the floor rather than freezing stiff. Most remarkably, people could walk barefoot across the entire cabin without the sharp shock of cold that made floor contact painful in conventional construction. As morning light revealed the storm's aftermath, neighbors began to understand that what they had witnessed wasn't simply better insulation or more efficient wood burning. Lars had solved the basic thermal challenge that made frontier winters so difficult to survive comfortably. His earth berm had created a stable microclimate where the floor supported human habitation rather than fighting it, where fuel could be used for comfort rather than just survival, and where families could live normally instead of huddling around stoves while their extremities went numb. The mockery that had defined community opinion of the buried cabin died completely during that long night when 13 people discovered what it felt like to sleep with warm feet in the middle of a Minnesota blizzard. Henry Dobson spent the early morning hours walking the perimeter of the berm, studying the angle of the slope and estimating the volume of earth involved, already planning modifications to his own foundation that would begin as soon as the ground thawed. Spring 1888 arrived late in western Minnesota, with the last drifts from the January blizzard persisting into April along fence lines and in the deep shadows of building sites. When the earth finally thawed enough for assessment, the settlement could measure the winter's costs with brutal precision. Lars Nielsen's earth berm had slumped slightly but remained essentially intact, its carefully graded slope still deflecting runoff away from his cabin walls. His neighbor's foundations told a different story: scoured lower logs where wind had stripped away loose banking, frost heave around cornerstones, and in two cases, significant gaps where repeated freezing and thawing had shifted the ground beneath inadequately protected sill logs. The accounting went beyond structural damage. Henry Dobson stood in his woodshed counting the remnants of what had been 8 cords of split oak and pine the previous autumn. Less than half a cord remained, and he had been rationing fuel carefully since February. His final tally showed he had burned nearly 7 cords through the winter, compared to the 3.5 cords Lars had consumed while maintaining superior heating performance. The mathematics were unforgiving. Lars had achieved better results using roughly half the fuel, a difference that represented weeks of additional labor in cutting, splitting, and hauling wood. More sobering was the human cost that wood consumption numbers only hinted at. 2 children in the settlement had suffered frostbite serious enough to leave permanent damage to fingers and toes, both in cabins where floor temperatures had dropped below 25 degrees during the worst cold snaps. The German family had endured a week in February when their youngest boy developed a persistent cough that Pastor Johansson privately attributed to sleeping in conditions barely above freezing. None of these injuries had occurred in families that spent storm nights in the bermed cabin, where floor temperatures never dropped below 50 degrees. By September 1888, the sound of shovels rang across the settlement as neighbors who had once mocked Lars's buried house began their own earthwork projects. Henry Dobson started with a modified approach, banking his cabin to a height of 2.5 feet with a mixture of soil, straw, and well-rotted manure. The German family went further, excavating a trench around their entire foundation and building an earth ramp that reached within inches of their windowsills, following Lars's specifications almost exactly. The adaptations weren't uniform copies. Some families incorporated materials that reflected their own backgrounds and available resources. The Olsons mixed clay and chopped straw into their banking soil, creating a more cohesive mixture that shed water more effectively. Pastor Johansson supervised the banking of the small church, using a combination of earth and sod that gave the building the appearance of growing directly from the prairie, much like the traditional turf churches his grandfather had described from Norway. Lars found himself consulted as the unofficial engineer for these projects, advising on slope angles, drainage considerations, and the critical details that determined success or failure. He emphasized the importance of extending cabin eaves at least 18 to 24 inches beyond the berm's outer edge, ensuring that roof runoff would clear the earthwork entirely. Without proper water management, even the best constructed berm could become a foundation-rotting disaster within a few seasons. The technique also spread to agricultural buildings. Several farmers began banking their root cellars and storage buildings more heavily, extending the principle beyond human habitation to food preservation and livestock protection. One innovative homesteader applied Lars's approach to his chicken coop, creating an earth-bermed structure that kept his hens laying through winter weather that typically reduced egg production to nearly zero. Pastor Johansson documented these developments in letters back to Lutheran Synod headquarters and family in Norway, describing how immigrant building traditions were being adapted to plains conditions with remarkable success. His correspondence noted that the earth banking technique wasn't entirely new. Frontier families had been banking cabins with straw and manure for decades, but the systematic application of thick earth berms represented a significant advancement in understanding how to work with, rather than against, the thermal dynamics of the prairie environment. The historical context was deeper than most settlers realized. Plains Indian earth lodges had used similar principles for centuries, surrounding wooden frameworks with several feet of packed soil that maintained comfortable interior temperatures through both bitter winters and scorching summers. Norwegian and other Scandinavian immigrants brought knowledge of turf construction and earth-sheltered buildings that had proven effective in similarly harsh climates. What Lars had accomplished was the synthesis of these traditions into a technique specifically adapted to the log cabin construction that defined frontier architecture. By the 1890s, Earth-bermed cabins had become common enough throughout western Minnesota that land office records began noting them as a distinct category of frontier housing. Photographs from the period show cabins that appear to emerge from small hills, their earth ramps supporting prairie grass that grew directly over the thermal mass that kept families warm through the region's notorious winters. The long-term vindication was measured in simple human terms. Anna Dobson, who had been present during that crowded January night in Lars's cabin, would tell her grandchildren decades later about the feeling of walking barefoot across warm floorboards while a blizzard raged outside. She remembered not just the comfort, but the sense of security that came from knowing the floor wouldn't betray you to the cold, that children could play and sleep safely at the level where families actually lived their lives. The technique's effectiveness was ultimately proven not through engineering calculations, but through the accumulated experience of families who discovered that winter didn't have to mean choosing between burning excessive amounts of wood or accepting floors too cold for human comfort. Lars Nielsen's dirt ramp had demonstrated that the earth beneath their feet wasn't an enemy to be fought, but a thermal resource to be harnessed, a lesson that transformed how an entire generation of homesteaders understood the relationship between their buildings and the ground that supported them. On that Minnesota homestead, the earth berm everyone had initially mocked as burying a perfectly good cabin became the foundation for a tradition of practical building wisdom that proved the difference between merely surviving plains winters and living through them with dignity and reasonable comfort.